What's going on, everybody? It's Bromley. We're back. We're talking about programming principles. I haven't done a video on programming in a while, so we're due. And what I'm actually going to do is start revisiting some of the earlier topics, some of the rudimentary topics that I covered early on when I first started this channel. There are things that I might be inclined to look at and be like, okay, we took care of that, we got that, we covered it, let's move on. But that doesn't really give respect to the fact that so many of you might have found my channel recently, might not have gone through all 300 plus videos that I have up. So a lot of this stuff merits repeating. I also like to revisit simple topics that you might be inclined to gloss over because it's really easy to forget or kind of take for granted your mastery of these things. And when they leave your mind, they're not quite as readily available to be there to inform the decisions that you make in the future. So it's good to keep up on this stuff, to sharpen the saw, maybe remind yourself of some things you've forgotten, because when you do run into a problem or you do have a problem you're trying to solve, it's good to have all this stuff fresh in your mind. You'll be surprised at some of the bits of information that you can kind of rediscover. It's like rereading a book that you read in middle school. You'll find some new things. So we're going to cover training splits today. This is thing number one. This is the first stop on any programming run before you consider really exercise selection or which thresholds you're going to be training in, how you're going to structure training over weeks and months. The first thing you have to start off with is how you're going to organize training within the week. And that's going to dictate what you can get away with in terms of all those other things. So you can't put the cart before the horse. This is where it all starts. We're going to cover 5 different training splits that are very common. In fact, you would be pretty hard pressed to find training splits that don't fall in any of these categories. And you're actually going to find that there's a fair amount of overlap between them. Some of them are more similar than you might be inclined to think right off the bat, and we'll cover that. So we're going to get into these 5 splits, how they're structured, common variations you see, what they have in common, how they're meaningfully different, and most importantly, when you might be better suited to run one versus the other. So we're going to get into all of this. Now, first things first, considering what makes a good training split, it's kind of infuriating when you really get into the nitty-gritty and start picking all this stuff apart, because you're always going to be faced with, no matter what conclusions you come to about what's better or worse, you're always going to be faced with the reality that there are ample examples of people not just having success, but being world champions using a whole myriad of different methods. And it's really hard to really concretely identify what makes something better than something else, because there's so many examples out there of people excelling. Now, there's always the fact that genetics can overpower really bad training decisions. One of the reasons why just because somebody's really good and developed, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily a good authority or a good role model for how you should be training. So there's survivorship bias. The people that you're looking at the top, they're the ones that made it. So you have to also consider the people that maybe didn't make it, the people that ran into pitfalls, got injured, suffered overuse issues, whatever. So that's a very important thing to keep track of. Really, all you need for a good split is enough stress to spur growth and enough recovery to make it sustainable so that you don't overreach. That is it. All of training really comes down to just how you balance stress and recovery. Enough stress to keep moving you forward, but not so much stress that you start to feel like shit, or the weight doesn't move very well, or you start backsliding week to week. As far as including enough stress to grow, you need to first decide what takes priority. Is your training program going to emphasize hypertrophy, in which case you have to figure out which body parts are going to lead the charge there, or if you're going to try to distribute everything evenly and be a very well-rounded, physique-oriented fellow, or are you going to focus on strength primarily? And then you got to figure out which movements take precedent. Are you trying to get strength for some other athletic purpose where it doesn't really matter what lift as long as your ability to produce force goes up? Or is it going to be very contest specific and deal with specific events that you have to get ready for a powerlifting or strongman meet? Once you establish that, you can start populating your week with exercises and figuring out how you're going to increase that stress. As far as recovery is concerned, you really just need to understand what your tolerance is to workload, both in frequency and in how much workload you can handle within the week. People are adaptable. The whole point is that you're going to adapt, even if it's too much, that eventually you'll be in the pocket where you can grow and handle these high amounts of stress a little bit better. but there are kind of big areas outside of the margin where you might be surprised people tend to bleed into, where they're doing way too much or way too little. And you need to understand how long hard efforts can be sustained before you backslide. That's another thing, because when you're new and you get strong from doing absolutely everything, you just start to associate really, really hard work with incredible gains. And it reinforces this idea that you have to go, do more, work harder. And that's not sustainable, especially as you start to actually get strong. So as you get into intermediate territory, this can lead to backsliding. And it's a lot of what is responsible for the first plateaus that you experience. Now, the differences between each split are primarily going to come down to the frequency of each exercise, the emphasis on exercise selection, so how much of it is going to be big compound movements versus small isolation movements. Different splits will allow you to get away with more or less in regards to how much effort you can put on the big compound lifts. And it will have a lot to say about the duration of the workout. You know, when you're training 6 days a week and doing 3, 4, 5 times per week sessions with a particular lift, you're not going to have very, very long sessions. Whereas if you only train 2 or 3 days per week, you might have to dedicate a lot more time to training in those days. The frequency can range from 1 to 5 times per week or more. If you want to go to the extreme, there are Olympic weightlifting programs where guys train 6 days a week, twice a day. And the pattern is that with very high frequency, you're looking more at skill acquisition. It's more like practice touches, like the way a shot putter or a discus thrower would get practice touches, or the way that a high jumper would get practice touches with their approach and their setup and their execution. So think of frequency more as skill work, and that's kind of what you're fostering. And it's the total amount of work throughout the week that gets kept track of. So there's this mathematical element. Lower frequency is more about fatigue and strain, where it's you just creating a lot of stress in the short term so that you can create this immediate adaptive response that gives you a week to recover. So you're going to be really, really fresh because you had 7 full days to get rid of the soreness and replenish all of your energy stores. You come back psychologically, you're good to go. And there, we'll talk about the benefits and the trade-offs of that. But that's kind of the broad pattern there. Lower frequency, it's really about this scorched earth approach, getting enough work, enough of a hit in that one workout to get you to grow. As far as the emphasis on lifts goes, some programs, like a lot of high frequency programs, because they're skill oriented, are going to have almost exclusively competitive lifts. That's pretty common nowadays. Olympic lifting is especially common. And that's what a lot of our programming today is derived from. But very specialized powerlifting training, it's not uncommon to see guys that just really squat, bench, and deadlift and do that with a very high frequency. Whereas if you want to spend more attention on bringing up weaknesses, rounding out your physique, widening your base, you need a split that can accommodate those extra exercises and won't spread you thin. So the first one we're going to go over is the bro split. Now this is an excerpt, and some of these splits I covered in my books. This is from Base Strength, where I covered the classic bro split. By the way, Base Strength and all of my books are available for free to Patreon members if you are a paid Patreon member. So I always make sure that my publications are up there and available as a perk to Patreon members, so you can check that out. Or you can follow the link in the description and you can get it for yourself off of Amazon. Very proud of the reception that my books have had, and I plan on putting out a lot more in the future. From Base Strength, we have our classic bodybuilding split. And this is something you would see from Arnold's Bodybuilding Encyclopedia or from any bodybuilding rag, muscular development, whatever. It's as simple as it gets. Basic idea is one workout is going to be dedicated to one muscle group, or maybe a couple muscle groups, but each one's really going to get hit once a week. You're going to do as much work. Again, it's that scorched earth approach to make sure you get enough stress, enough volume and effort to get that muscle to grow. Give it a week to recover, focus on other body parts in that time. It is a pretty good way, for as much as it gets knocked or disregarded, it is a pretty good way to check a few different boxes. It's very hard to overreach on this program. It pretty much guarantees that you're going to have enough time in the workout to get enough of a training stress to kind of annihilate that muscle and get it to grow, to get a good positive response out of it. And it solves a lot of problems with new lifters. It prioritizes a well-rounded base, which I am huge on. If you've read anything I've put out, you know how big I am on making sure that you have a wide base, that you're symmetrical, you're not getting weaknesses, because only doing compound movements Great for general strength development, but as time goes on, you're going to notice that weak points become more prevalent because everybody based on their build is going to respond differently in how they acquire muscle mass and where they grow from doing one particular compound movement. So take two people with two different builds and have them just bench press. You might find one guy might have a propensity for his shoulders and triceps growing a little more than another guy, depending on leverages and things like that. It's not really worth getting into, but you just have to be aware of, if you have a really one-dimensional approach, you're opening up the possibility that you develop weaknesses. So starting out with a really well-rounded physique, it's only going to push further down the line in your training career, the point where that becomes a problem. So I am a big fan of this. Now, this started, sources kind of put this as like a 70s era thing. If you look back to like 1940s, 50s, 60s, you see a lot of what people do today as far as good basic strength-based barbell stuff being kind of the backbone of even bodybuilding and physique back in the day. This is the origination of fives-based programs that are very popular. So you're looking kind of before the 70s, still more of a lean on compound movements, heavier weight, a lot of crossover between competitive lifting and bodybuilding. In the 70s, guys really started focusing on hypertrophy-specific work and splitting everything apart. Every muscle gets trained separately. That's a hallmark. The benefit, again, well-rounded development. That's a huge one. It allows each muscle to be exposed to a ton of fatigue at once. Smaller groups that tend to become weak points are taken care of automatically. So unless you're outright skipping bicep day or back day, you're giving equal attention to everything, and that's a big benefit. And there's plenty of recovery. Again, big problem for new lifters is overreaching, doing too much for too long, and wondering why they hit a brick wall. This makes it very, very difficult. Unless you're like maxing out on every lift every day of the week, it's very hard to overreach on this type of program. Now, it's the focus of a lot of analysis because people say, is it optimal? You see a lot, especially in the last decade or so, a lot of discussion about optimal training frequencies. And there's this idea that many muscles can be trained and should be trained multiple times per week. Smaller muscle groups can get hit 3 or 4 times per week. Bigger muscle groups can get hit minimum twice per week. And you're going to get a lot more progress per period of time spent lifting if you do that. Now, here's the thing. I don't like optimal being the enemy of good. You don't want to be that person that thinks, well, it's not optimal. Look at the opportunity cost. Look at what you are preventing, the problems that you are preventing from becoming an issue by the program that you're taking on. Because if you only look at what's optimal, you're going to disregard the fact that many times the most optimal approach is actually like walking a tightrope, and it has more complexity and there's more things that can potentially go wrong. So the best program is the one you're going to do that works, that doesn't run you into a wall, that doesn't have a lot of pitfalls. As long as you can put in a unit of investment as far as time spent training and grow, it's a good program. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, as they say, or some other old-timey analogy as far as telling you not to be an overly critical asshole. Main complaints: frequency is too low for smaller muscle groups. Again, smaller muscle groups can be trained repeatedly, but the main support, it's worked for many people over the years. Many, many people, including good athletes, good bodybuilders. Even though you don't look at this and think strength program, it's actually done a lot to increase size, symmetry, and build a foundation for strength and performance in a lot of people. But you also have to keep in mind genetics and PEDs, like I said before, can lead pros to grow from non-optimal training where it might not work for you. So if you're having a hard time responding from once per week training, and you know you're putting in the volume, you know you're doing a shit ton of work, and it's just not, you're just not growing, you're sleeping and eating plenty, and it's not working, you might need a higher dose of stress. You might need more frequent training, and that might be what is required to get that meter to tick forward. An updated bro split. Now, I am a fan of once a week training, especially for novices. As you start to get advanced, again, more doses of stress are going to be required, and you have to get creative because you can't just do more and expect a good result. You still have to balance it out with recovery, which can get kind of tricky. An updated bro split is going to have each muscle group minimum twice a week. So this is a good lean on a single body part split type workout where everything is still bracketed off by individual muscle group, but now you have to double up. So instead of having just chest day, now you have to double up. So maybe chest and delts go good together, back and quads, delts, bis, and tris. There's a lot of different ways to arrange it. Really, you just have to kind of approach it as you go. Everybody's going to have a little bit of a different tolerance. You might find that you have a hard time doing delts and chest because the pressing work fatigues you for overhead, and maybe you feel like you're better off if your delts are fresh. This really is personal preference. Don't worry about this too much unless you put it into practice and realize that it creates a problem. Remember, the decisions you make, you shouldn't be just screwing with things based off of what you think might probably happen. Reserve most of your training decisions and the big changes you make to your training to solve specific problems. Let it become an issue. Demonstrate to yourself that this doesn't work, and then you can start to focus on the minutia here. But I have outlined here in the green, you're going to see the main movements for each body part. These are the heavy ones, so these take priority. Like if you had to skip anything, these would not be the things you skip. The yellow is going to be kind of secondary movements. They're still very big movements. They're very substantial. They pack a wallop. The white stuff is smaller isolation movements. So you're looking at things like bridges and hamstring curls, machine work, isolation work, stuff like that. And all of it is relevant. You have a limited capacity to do a lot of work with big compound movements. Yeah, they pack a wallop, but at the same time, you can't do 15 exercises. That's where you get into, 15 sets of the same exercise. Fatigue sets in and you stop really getting that strength specific stimulus out of it. And that's where these smaller isolation movements come in, because you can continue stressing the muscle in a meaningful way without being limited by how efficiently your nervous system's operating or fatigue from other structures that are brought in that are necessary for big compound movements. You know, if you're squatting and your upper back fatigues, that's a problem, but you can keep stressing your legs with leg presses and hack squats and things like that. So they all serve a purpose. So this is just a basic idea. 4 to 6 sets is very normal for hypertrophy specific work. 8 to 15 reps is normal, but you could also include a strength protocol for the big movements, the stuff in green. It's really easy to blend strength and hypertrophy work. You could do a double progression. You could do a top set type progression that kind of waves over 3 weeks. And I have many of those outlined in base strength. Very easy to marry strength. Doesn't take a ton of specific low rep work. It really can be as easy as working up to a top set, running a reverse pyramid. You benefit from post-activation potentiation, and the rest of the work you do in a normal hypertrophy split works amazing for most people. Second split. Now this is going to look kind of close to the bro split, but the emphasis on lift is going to be different. This is the 1 lift per day. This is very common in pop culture programming. You see it with Juggernaut, with 5-3-1. I believe the cube method. There's a lot of others you can list where it's like a squat day, a bench day, an overhead day, a deadlift day. 4 days per week, each one dedicated to the main lift. Now, that doesn't in practice look a lot different from one body part per day, except that the emphasis is on the movement as opposed to the body parts. So this type of split might be more inclined to have more variation to the main movement as opposed to going way into the weeds with isolation stuff. You can still, of course, prescribe machine stuff, unilateral work and isolation work and so on. But the emphasis here is more skill, strength, performance with these particular movements. Now, the order of operations here, it's not so much with the body part split. You don't really have to worry about the order of exercises because it's really just about fatigue. And you can do things like pre-fatigue. You can do a lot of stuff to just wipe you out that doesn't necessarily have to prioritize performance on the biggest lift. With this type of split, you are going to want to start with the main lift. Just like if you were a sprinter, you would want to start with your 100-meter sprint when you're fresh. You wouldn't do a 5-mile run and then try to do your time sprint. The limiting factor would be fatigue instead of speed. So here you want the limiting factor to be strength. So you have to do that when you're fresh. Then you go into your second lift, which is a mechanically similar movement, a close variation. And then you taper into your smaller movements that are easier to recover from, that you can do even when you're gassed, and you can really focus on obliterating the muscle there. The main lift, it's really easy to just copy and paste a strength progression, linear periodization. You start from 10s and taper down. You do linear progression. You can use a static strength progression. Again, these are all things I've made videos about, and a lot of them are covered in base strength and peak strength. This is like a 1.5 times frequency because it is one lift per day. So bench, overhead, squat, deadlift. I mean, you could kind of look at that like chest, shoulders, quads, glutes, hamstrings, and throw rowing in there somewhere. Now, the thing is, the pressing movements and the lower body movements, there's some sharing of muscles. So the same muscles will kind of get hit twice, just in different movement patterns. So it's not quite the same stress as doing the same movement twice per week, but it's not quite the same stress as isolating each muscle group once per week. Overhead pressing and benching both take a toll on the delts and triceps. Squatting and deadlifting both heavily incorporate glutes, hamstrings, midsection, upper back, and so on. So I kind of consider this like 1.5 times frequency. It does allow each muscle to be exposed to a ton of fatigue at once in one workout because you're focusing just on that one lift and its constituent parts, but also there is plenty of recovery. So this one also very easy to overreach, very difficult to overreach. You might find that you have a hard time paying just as much attention to squatting as you do deadlifting, maybe even similarly with overhead pressing and benching. But again, those are problems to be dealt with when you run into them. All relevant exercise get hit in that day across a variety of rep ranges. That's another thing. You want to use a variety of rep ranges here. Because there is lower frequency, getting the most amount of work means running the gamut from heavy strength specific stuff to more volume-based stuff to flat out high rep, acid buildup, substrate deficit work that burns and sucks and creates a lot of tissue tear down. You're going to be best off having those in pretty even representation. You're not going to, if you're doing triples for your main lift, you're not also going to do triples for like your hamstring curls. It's good to have a mix of sets and reps in there. And this is another example I have outlined in base strength, one lift per day. Very simple. Bench, squat, overhead, deadlift with close variations. So the variations, the smaller movements that you do for more volume. Pin pressing is a great option. Box squat, push press, 13-inch deadlift. These are all overload movements. And I actually write more about how different phases can prioritize, like a base phase would prioritize developmental work. So that's stuff that goes through more range of motion. Whereas a peak or more strength focused block will have movements like these where the load is higher, it's more neurological. And then you follow it up with all of your relevant hypertrophy stuff, again, to make sure weaknesses don't set in and you stay well-rounded. Third split, push-pull squat, or you can think of this as push-pull legs, depending on how you handle your lower body day. This coincides with the power lifts, so like a bench press day, a deadlift day, a squat day. I've also seen it where the pull day is just rowing. So it's like 2 upper body days, a push day, a row day, and then a third day for squatting and deadlifting type movements. You have some options with how you structure that. Keeping the movement patterns together is very convenient for skill acquisition, and the days don't tend to interfere with each other. This is pretty easy to run. Now, the lowest frequency split of this version, it's 3 days per week, which might be kind of low. Now, more advanced lifters and fast gainers specifically can get away with that low frequency, and they might even be better for it. But if you're a hard gainer, Josh Bryant has a great analogy for this. Just like the slow kid has to hit the books more, slow gainers, people who are underweight, typically females and also older populations have to train with more frequency and benefit from training harder more often. So then you might look at doubling this up to doing a 6 day per week split. You don't see a lot of people do that because 6 days per week can be overkill and you might be better off consolidating the work. So it's going to look like 2 pressing days, 2 lower body days, and then 2 rowing days, which might be excessive. Do you really need to do bent rows twice per week? Or can't you just fit them in on your upper body days? You probably can, and that's where another split is going to make a little bit more sense. You don't see a lot of people running the split for that reason. Now, if you do run it this way, maybe you would think about limiting to just 1 pulling session per week, then 2 upper body, 2 lower body is a very common split. And it gives you some freedom. You can train different things on those alternating days, and that's where we get a little bit more complex. Push-pull legs, by itself, I think of in the 3 day per week form, which is low frequency, higher volume in each workout, going to be more appropriate for people that don't need and actually might benefit from less doses of stress. Again, more advanced athletes and fast gainers. You also have to keep in mind that muscles and movements can recover at different rates. So dosing the exact same frequency for rowing as you do for pressing, as you do for lower body, that might get a little hairy. And you might find that squatting and deadlifting, it's not so easy as doing them all in the same day. some people actually might find that even splitting them apart and doing them both in the same week is problematic. Very individualistic. You have to pay attention and again, make changes that solve problems for you. A 3-day push-pull squat, it's likely best for fast gainers, covered that already. 6 days likely to work for, I think, a bigger group of people, but it is a bigger commitment, and I think it's a little bit excessive. So this is just a simple breakdown. Again, the green are the main movements, starting with benching and then going to a variation like incline. Choosing the variation based on what your immediate goals are. Are you base building? Then you want more variety, instability, more range of motion, more tempo. Are you in a peak phase? You're going to want more overload, partial ranges of motion, accommodating resistance. That's what makes more sense. And then you go into your isolation stuff, the smaller movements. I think they should always be present for most people in some capacity. Even when you look at very specialized stuff like Shiko, very, very barbell specific, competition movement specific work, he still throws in things like good mornings and lunges and dumbbell work. There's still a bit of that present. So you're never too good to do basic bodybuilding movements. Remember that. Fourth split, 2 upper, 2 lower. And this is where it starts to look like other programs. Is 2 upper, 2 lower really that different than doing 1 lift per day? Because overhead and bench, it's upper body, that's 2 upper body days. Squat and deadlift, that's 2 lower body days. The context here is that it's blended. So you're going to do a little bit of everything for your upper body and your lower body on their respective days. So like squat and deadlift work on the same day, bench and overhead press on the same day. Now this allows 2 times per week frequency on everything. Greater dosage of stress might be appropriate for more people because most movements you can train twice per week as long as you're managing the amount of work you're doing in each split. Also for people that started off 1 time per week, maybe hit a plateau, increasing frequency, really easy way to increase the dose, and it might be more appropriate as you get a little bit more developed. Now, the trade-off here is it's a little more complex. So you have to understand how you're going to run your progression because most people, especially as you get intermediate, you're not just going to be adding weight each session every 3 or 4 days. It doesn't work like that. So you might have to have a heavier, lighter day, volume or intensity day, strength or hypertrophy day, a lot of different ways to kind of offset the work so it's sustainable. You can have the same progression, but do different movement variations. Having a different movement pattern is in itself kind of a form of recovery. So maybe you're doing the same, I don't know, 5x5, but one day it's deadlifts from the floor. The other day it's a Romanian deadlift or a snatch grip deadlift. That allows you to handle a higher frequency in a little bit more straightforward way. Now, here's the thing. Lower body lifts tend to outpace the upper body lifts. This forces all upper body muscles into 2 days. Now, this forces all upper body muscles into 2 days. There's a lot of upper body muscles. It's a lot of them. So that might be a problem. I have been known to sneak my rows in onto lower body days, but when you're trying to create a well-rounded upper body that can actually press its way out of a paper bag, you need delt work, you need tricep work, yeah, you need bicep work. Hate to break it to you. Upper back's got to get hit, pec's got to get hit. So it's up to you to figure out how much of those are getting hit substantially in the main lifts and how much of a dose of isolation or smaller exercise you need to get the amount of growth in those areas so that they don't become glaring weak points. It might be hard to do that within only 2 days, especially if you're in a base phase, a developmental phase. And if that's the case, it might be warranted to sneak in a 3rd day where you can dedicate to, let's say, arms or upper back or whatever. If you have a hard time doing it on top of all of the other work, this works best when 1 upper and 1 lower body movement are prioritized. So I don't recommend this trying to give equal attention to all 4 lifts. I recommend this prioritizing, like bench and squat is very common because typically deadlifting benefits from less dose. Squat tends to be a little easier to recover from. And benching is typically a priority for most people. Strongman split might be overhead and deadlift priority. Squatting and bench pressing as supplementary exercises. That's possible too. But I think that is a better way to do it. And then again, you go back to kind of prioritizing 1 day volume or hypertrophy or a different movement, and another day a little bit heavier, a little more intensity. And that's how you typically offset those. So this is an example. I believe this is at a peak strength, 2 upper, 2 lower body. So you see squat, bench, deadlift, press, developmental deadlift. So I'm signifying here what type of movement I'm putting in. The secondary movements here are going to be more developmental, in this particular phase. This is a base progression I have written out here. So that's more about increasing capacity, growing size. So developmental squat movement would be like a front squat, whereas a, let's say, strength or overload squat movement might be like a box squat. For deadlifts, like a stiff leg deadlift or a deficit deadlift, something where you can cycle through more reps, puts you through more range of motion typically. Developmental overhead, like a behind the neck press. And then again, going back into the isolation movements, smaller movements. So this is how a 3-week wave would go for each of the movements. So each wave is 3 weeks. So weeks 1, 2, 3, and then you'd reset in wave 2 and then wave 3. So that's 9 weeks of base building here. You get through all that, you should come out on the other end, good amount of size on your frame. If you didn't, it's because you didn't do a good job with weight selection. You weren't consistent. You weren't eating properly. That's really what it comes down to. You can't subject yourself to this amount of work on this progression and not see some type of adaptation from your body. That's just not going to happen. This is an example of Big Bully. I outlined this in peak phase. The Bull Massive program was kind of the focus of peak phase. And the Bull Massive program was kind of the focus of peak strength, the follow-up book to base strength. And I had a linear progression for novices. I have Bull Massive, which is a good, solid intermediate program. Big Bully is a more advanced program. So here you see me really emphasizing the 2 lifts, squat, bench. And then I'm targeting squat. So that's like a squat emphasis day. And day 2 is going to be a little more deadlift emphasis because the second and third, second exercise is a deadlift movement. So you're a little more fresh for that. So we're still blending everything, but the bread and butter here is squatting. And like I say in the bottom, if you have different goals, you absolutely can prioritize overhead pressing and deadlifting. And for strongman, that makes perfect sense. You just have to pay attention to your recoverability because many people will struggle to recover from deads quite as well as they will from squats, which is why squats usually a good default move for twice a week frequency and above. 5th split that we're going to cover, whole body. Now, this is the throwback, like I was talking about 1940s, 50s, 60s, very common for guys to do whole body workouts. There's a whole strength subculture that's dedicated to that to this day. It's kind of the backbone of starting strength and the linear progressions you know of. It exploits how effective simple barbell movements are for growth and the fact that you can typically train them multiple times per week. So all the muscle groups or movement patterns are hit in each workout, and there can be a different lean. You could have a whole body bodybuilding approach that's made up really heavily of like dumbbell and machine and isolation movements, or you can have it really focus on squat, benching, and deadlifting, like, you know, everything that's derived from like Bill Starr's 5x5. Again, starting strength and strong lifts and gray skull and all that. The benefit is that there's the highest amount of frequency. You get the most touches. So even if you do less work within a workout, more of that work is fresh. If you're doing 12 sets of, let's say, squatting in a workout, sets 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you're going to be gassed. Weight's not going to be as heavy. If you can spread it out to a different day, you can get the same total number of sets in a workout, in a week, but have more of them be fresh. So the weight's higher, the aggression's higher, your technique's crisper, better overall stress. And that's not just a hypothesis. That seems to be fleshed out when you follow around people that engage in this type of training. So it is the most optimized, but it also has the potential of pitfalls. Overreaching can be a problem. If you're not good at gauging RPE, if you're not good at analyzing how much stress you're dealing with, what dosage of stress you're dealing with in a workout, you have a hard time mitigating that, you can very easily fall into a pattern of overreaching. So that's a downside. It is the most complex. Framework is also a bit less intuitive, and it does require keeping track of each component independently of the others. And you do have to know, okay, if I'm training 3 days per week, what's my progression like? What am I doing on days 1, 2, and 3? There's a lot of options, and that can seem crippling. I like, as a default, I'll recommend on a whole body split to do DUP or something like a Texas method or like a heavy, light, medium. Subtle difference between the two. DUP is focused on working in different thresholds. So you have a hypertrophy day where you're doing like 8s or 10s, a strength day where you're doing like 4s and 6s. You might have a power day where you're doing speed work. That's different than something like Texas method where you're doing 5s on each day, but there's like heavier, medium, and lighter days to allow recovery. So kind of undulating the effort you put out and the total amount of work makes it sustainable. So it's a slight difference between the two. They both work very well. Also, downside, it is exhausting. It's hard to get sufficient work in multiple compound movements. I mean, it's like running through a mini powerlifting meet every time you train. Now, that can be a good thing because it can temper you to that. You shouldn't be the person that goes in and gets gassed by the time you get to your deadlift openers from a powerlifting meet. That just means you're out of shape. So a good way around that is to practice it in training. Eventually, it does become routine. But psychologically, it can be hard to really put the gas out, really put the pedal to the metal on that third or fourth compound movement of the day when you've ran through everything. So you do want to make sure you're taking appropriate breaks in between each big movement. You want to make sure you're using an intra workout, have sugar and caffeine available. If you take pre-workout or a bang, don't just pound it right before you get to the gym. Sip it through the first half, and about the halfway point, take the rest to the head, and you'll find that that'll carry you through the rest of the workout. So it just takes a little bit of tweaking. This is another very simple breakdown. This is a heavy, medium, light example, and you offset it. So you're not going to do Monday all your heavy sets. By the time you get to deads, you would have nothing left. So you can do your light deadlift work on your heavy squat day, and by staggering it, it makes it a little more sustainable. This is just a blanket example of a heavy, medium, light. So like a heavy day might be a top set of 5. Medium day is like your volume day. So you take 90% of that and do repeating sets of your top 5. And your light day is just recovery. Volume's lower, weight's lower. Now, this is a good bodybuilding iteration of a whole body. And this is where you're going to kind of emphasize the big movement. You're going to rotate that emphasis from day to day. So you wouldn't always run through things in the same order, because then you're always going to be more fatigued. If you put legs last, you're always going to be most fatigued for legs. So it does make sense to stagger them. So this is a 6-day per week split. You run through 3 to 5 sets of a good, solid developmental exercise. You can rotate them from day to day, or you can play it really simple and have the same ones. But you're going to be able to go a little heavier, a little more all out with that first exercise. So you might go from chest to quads to delts to back to arms to glutes to hams and recycle through it. If you are in a long off-season run, and you just need to put some size on, I think this is a very viable approach. You could have your main movement of the day be a main compound. So for chest, it'd be bench, quads, it would be squat, delts overhead, and so on. And then you can have the rest made up of smaller bodybuilding type movements, and you can vary them day to day. You can have a lot of fun with a split like this, but the frequency, provided your joints can hold up to it, very, very good, viable way to grow. So the considerations before you hop around on different splits: consider how many times per week you can realistically train. Do not commit to a 5-day per week split if you can only make 3. So that's a big one. People often bite off more than they can chew. They think they can do 6 days a week, and it's like, yeah, it'll be great. And then they frequently miss 2-3 days per week. That's a problem. The best program is the one you can commit to. You have to consider what your tolerance is to long sessions. If you're looking at 30 plus sets on a very high volume, low frequency program, you might get 20 sets in and realize it's just not tenable. But if you lose gas a few exercises in or skip the last few, it's pointless. You have to consider what your tolerance is to frequency. Generally, overuse issues are the limiting factor. So if your elbows get raw, if you do curls too often, you're not going to want to curl 3 times per week. Don't try a routine like Smolov if your knee's already hurt, right? So you got to take inventory of what your tolerance is. I have historically had some issues with overuse stuff, so I have to be careful. I can't just go reckless on frequency, or else my hips and knees start talking to me. So for me, once to twice a week tends to be about right. 3 or 4 times would hypothetically make me stronger if I just lathered up in DMSO and popped a bunch of ibuprofen, but I'm not willing to do that. So I'd rather keep frequency down to let my joints recover a little bit more easily. You also have to consider what your immediate goals are. Are you in an off-season hypertrophy phase? Are you focusing on weak areas? Or are you trying to get overload in? Is it movement specificity? Is it strength for something else? These are all relevant. You have a lot more leeway for a general athletic program where you just have to kind of get stronger to make you better at another sport than if you absolutely have to get ready for this one specific movement in a strongman event or a powerlifting meet. So those are going to lend themselves to very different splits. Generally, you're going to see most of these splits have in common couple times per week frequency for the big lifts. It's very common. A lot of isolation movements, or a fair amount of like machines and accessories that are not just strictly done on a barbell. Most splits you see are going to be like that. The exceptions tend to be the ones that are exclusively barbell work, or the ones that are exclusively light bodybuilding work. That doesn't tend to encompass as many people because it's fucking monotonous and boring. It's fun to have a blend of different stuff and try to get them to exploit them to get the best possible result. So those are some things to consider. And as always, do you have an actual problem you were trying to solve, or are you just screwing with things for the sake of it? Remember, there are no bonus points for doing everything. Stick to something. Everything works. You just have to find the right prescription for that specific thing you were trying to implement. And that can take time. There's a learning curve. Don't write something off just because it didn't work the first time. Make changes based on problems you're trying to solve. So that is my coverage of different training splits. Thank you so much for stopping by. I have a lot more of these slideshow type presentations up. Most of these are going to be featured on the podcast. So go ahead and check out the Base Strength podcast as well. And if you haven't, go ahead and check out the Facebook group. It is absolutely free. We got about 1,100 members there. Good resource of information. A lot of smart people there fielding questions. If you have questions about general training or anything I've written or said, good source of information there. And also remember, Base Strength, Peak Strength, Superior Deadlift, those can be gotten at the link below on Amazon, or you can sign up for Patreon, and all of my publications end up there for free, no extra charge for Patreon members as an extra perk. I always make those available. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.